Thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you this morning and also to share in the worship time with you. Partake of the Lord's Supper, say farewell to Scott and family, to hear the wonderful testimony we heard and got to sit beside the fruit of that blessing, have a little conversation with her. I love the theme that emerged in the service today that was particularly about loving neighbor. All the way through, you could see that and the importance of that, and that love is to be expressed in action. On April 27, 1987, I was arrested along with 15 other people, including 2 elders and a deacon from our church, for refusing to leave the lobby of an abortion clinic at 173 East McMillan Street in Cincinnati, Ohio. This abortion clinic was operated by Dr. Martin Haskell, who was the pioneer and face of the procedure called a partial birth abortion. That day there were 25 abortions scheduled that did not take place. There were 2 nurses who resigned from their job. In June of 1987, I was found guilty of criminal trespass in the court of Judge Nadine Allen, Municipal Court, a 4th-degree misdemeanor. I was fined and given 40 hours of community service and a 12-month probation. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, but I just wanted to put that out there at the beginning and step back and talk a little bit first about what is God's call and the call of the gospel related to pro-life issues. First of all, as Christians, we're called to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the Bible is consistently clear that loving our neighbor does not just mean people like us or the people that we enjoy being with in a tightly closed circle, but it includes, and there's special care even in terms of the grain in the field in the story of Ruth this morning, that God is concerned for those who are on the margins, who are displaced, who are outside of the blessings that many of us experience without even thinking about it. The Bible also says that we're to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to be advocates for people who are in need. And we're also to recognize that people who are engaged in activities like abortions, for example, are not always the ones who are responsible primarily, like our friend this morning, that there were circumstances of a crisis pregnancy, of being sinned against by others, and the importance of recognizing that we are concerned for all of our neighbors as we engage on this critical issue. Today with the Life Chain, and I had the privilege of being a part of several in Cincinnati when they first started back in the late 80s, is really an opportunity for a public crying out to God for His mercy, for His intervention, for His work. In some ways, it's both crying out to God and also crying out in lament for this that continues to happen in our midst, and to weep and cry out that God would meet us in this time of sadness. We've heard a lot about Supreme Court justice in the last few weeks. I've been one that's been praying for 35 years that God would bring about change of heart on those who were on the Supreme Court and new people to the Supreme Court that would advocate for justice and care for human life in the womb and others who are in danger outside of the womb. You know, the government's role is to promote good and restrain evil, according to Romans chapter 13. And they don't always do that well. And I think it's appropriate, particularly in a nation like ours, for us to exercise the opportunities we have through voting and other means to try to get people in place who will be consistently seeking to promote good and restrain evil. But we need more than Supreme Court justices. We need doctors and lawyers and educators and parents and churches and businesses and legislators. It is a multifaceted call on the people of God to stand up for the unborn and others who are pressed into places of grave danger throughout the whole range of life, be it handicapped or elderly, and so on. Each of us has to wrestle with the stewarding of the opportunities that are in front of us. And those change over the course of a lifetime. But we not only have to steward what opportunities are in front of us, but also create new opportunities to be able to stand for mercy and justice and the righteousness of God. The ultimate transformation on these issues has to take place in the hearts of people. Gospel transformation will bring about the only lasting change as we seek to winsomely engage and speak the truth in love. Well, that's sort of a general call that I'm trying to put out there, but what were the specific circumstances that led up to my being arrested and found guilty of criminal trespass? Well, I was ordained in the Presbyterian Church in America as a teaching elder in 1975. In 1978, the PCA came out with a statement on abortion. Very strong statement. Later, about 10 years later, the PCA adopted a report on what was called the church-state relations, and there was a portion of that addressed whether or not nonviolent civil disobedience was appropriate in relationship to abortions. The Church of the Covenant, which I served at that time in Cincinnati, Ohio, had a very high commitment to the gospel of the kingdom impacting all of Cincinnati, and the matters of pro-life issues, particularly related to abortion in our city, were very high on that passion and vision for the kind of church that we would be. So we did our own study and came up with our own statement that said it was appropriate for believing Christians in circumstances where little ones in the womb were in danger of being put to death, that we could intervene by being present in nonviolent ways, trying to stop that from happening. Okay? That's why there ended up being 2 elders and 1 deacon, as well as the pastor, who were involved among the 15 who were arrested in 1987. We had studied passages like Genesis 1, which speaks of God's image and likeness being a human person being made in God's image, and therefore having inherent dignity and value. We looked at Genesis 4, where you have sinful rebellion and murder, where Cain kills his brother Abel. That's not the way God intended things to be, the taking of human life made in his image. We looked at places like Micah 6, verse 8, that the Lord wants his people to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. We understood the definition of neighbor was expanded by Jesus in the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the definition of neighbor being the one in need, not just the one that I want to be with. Proverbs 31, 8 and 9 says we're to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves and defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Proverbs 24, 11, rescue those being led away to death. And those two things converged around the decision that some of us made to go into the clinic and refuse to leave, trying to stop the abortions that particular day. So our congregation was involved in many pro-life activities, speaking for those who couldn't speak, who were silent, trying to give a window into the womb of pregnant women that there was human life there as we try to teach. So preaching and teaching and praying. I was involved over a 2-year period every Thursday morning, going with one of the deacons of the church and a couple of the women from the church to Planned Parenthood in Cincinnati, Ohio, every Thursday morning, trying to talk with women in what we call sidewalk counseling, to convince them not to go into Planned Parenthood, but to go down to the Crisis Pregnancy Center a couple of blocks away. I was involved in helping to start or support a number of new organizations. Life Chain was beginning at that time, like we're going to experience today. Right to Life was headquartered in Cincinnati with Dr. Wilkie and his wife. We started a group called Act for Life, which is very much like Churches for Life here in Cincinnati. One of the hospitals, of all the hospitals, called Christ Hospital, actually did a few abortions every year, and we felt that we needed to try to bring pressure against Christ Hospital to be faithful to its name and not abort babies. And so we tried to get opportunity to have conversations with people, board of directors and so on, and tell them we thought they should stop that. And they said, no, we don't think we should. And so we took to the streets and we held signs in front of Christ Hospital. And they decided they wanted to meet with us again. And eventually they eliminated allowing, at least at that particular time, any abortions taking place. Crisis Pregnancy Centers, Bethany Christian Adoption Services, and a number of pro-life groups that were growing in Cincinnati at that time, some who were even involved in violent activity, which we were against, which included the bombing of Planned Parenthood. And I later found out that the man who was behind that was actually coming to evening services at our church. Wasn't a member of our church, but at the same time, that was a challenging sort of time to say, where do we draw the line as we seek to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. I was invited at the ripe old age of 33 to be a facilitator of 15 to 20 pro-life groups that came together to discuss how we might be able to work more with each other rather than saying what we're doing is the most important, or trying to understand how we could be supportive of one another, and that didn't mean that we were trying to diminish what we most felt God wanted us to be involved in. And then finally, around this time, a man by the name of Randall Terry started an organization called Operation Rescue. And that was part of what opened us to consider possibilities. But what I want to say to you in all of this is that part of the way God worked was not only standing, I want to say courageously, but we had a lot of fear, for the kinds of things that we needed to stand for. Not just speaking truth and acting in relationship to that truth, but believing that truth includes love. I sometimes, recently, in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul ends by saying, faith, hope, and love, these three, the greatest of these is love. Now, faith and hope find their ways into the doctrinal studies that we have called systematic theologies. But I've never seen a chapter in a systematic theology on love. But it's the greatest. And so anything we do around speaking of truth, anything that has to do with truth, it's always grace and truth. Speak truth in love. Love God, love neighbor. And so the manner in which we stand for righteousness, if we're going to be truly righteous, includes expressing it with the love that we've received, extended to others. Well, the rescue mission. The plan was that we would enter the clinic and sit down in the lobby and try to shut it down for the day. Now, in the law, you can't be accused of fourth-degree misdemeanor unless the owner of the property or an agent acting on behalf of the owner asks you to leave and you refuse to leave. That becomes a definition of criminal trespass. So we entered, we sat in the lobby, we sang, we prayed, we read scripture. There's a sense in which we took worship into the abortion clinic and cried out to God as his representatives there. Time passed, time was of the essence. The more time passed, the less abortions would take place. The owner happened to be the doctor's wife, and she was in Dayton and couldn't be reached. So we had a little more time. So eventually the police came in and asked us to leave. And unless we did, we would be arrested. Now, one of the great things about the police in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is a highly German Roman Catholic city, is there were a number of Roman Catholic pro-life policemen who were actually glad we were there, even though they had to arrest us. And so they worked out with us that we could go as slowly as we wanted to the paddy wagons, as long as we didn't make them carry us. So we used up a lot of time. It was a really slow walk from the clinic to the wagons. We were put in a holding cell, had our mug shots taken, and then released on an OR bond, which is on your own recognizance. They trust that you would come back to court. So we found out later that 25 abortions had been canceled that day, and the two of the women were decided, based on our presence there that day, at least in part, that they did not and could not work there any longer. So they resigned. Well, God intervened that day, but he also intervened a couple of months later in Hamilton County Municipal Court. The judge, Nadine Allen, was a 35-year-old African-American female judge endorsed by the National Organization of Women. This is 1987. And her clerk was a volunteer escort at Planned Parenthood, whom many of us already knew because she was trying to get the women into the clinic while we were trying to get the women down to the Crisis Pregnancy Center. So things seemed to be pretty stacked against us. The prosecutor proposed a motion called an in limine motion where it passed that we were not allowed at any point in testimony, cross-examination, any part of the court proceedings to explain anything related to when life began or what an abortion was or anything related to that. And so we were pretty much silenced as to why we would be in that particular place. We decided to be our own attorneys, even though we had a wonderful pro-life attorney counseling us a bit on the side. And we went in 3 groups of 5, and I was in the first group. So we thought, well, how do we get the jury to try to understand why we would do this? Why would these fine, upstanding citizens be found guilty of criminal trespass at this particular address? So we thought, well, let's try to get some character witnesses or something that maybe it'll plant some seeds of doubt that something must be going on there that we would do that. So in the process, we were counseled that if the prosecutor did not prove that the owner or someone acting as an agent of the owner actually asked us to leave, that we should make a motion for a mistrial. So being naive and not an attorney, when the police officer didn't seem to me to say anything about acting on behalf of the owner of the building, I said, Your Honor, I'd like to move for a mistrial. And she said, she didn't say this out loud, so I'm like, what are you talking about? But anyway, she said, come back to my chambers. So we went back, and the prosecutor went back, and she said, that's a nice try, but it's not going to work. So the prosecutor said, how much longer are we going to have to keep these people, keep the jury for this thing to go on when it's obvious they're guilty, yada, yada, yada. And Judge Allen said this, that depends on if any of them are going to take the stand on their own behalf to testify to their state of mind at the time they were there. I thought, man, that's a pretty long answer. And then I thought, that's where criminal insanity usually comes in. You know, my state of mind at the time that I committed this crime. So I thought about that and prayed about that, and we're back out in the courtroom, and I said, Your Honor, if I'm going to take the stand on my own behalf, is this the time to do it? She said, yes. So I got up and I said, Your Honor, I don't want to debate again the motion. I might have even said what I think is an unfair motion about, what we could speak to. But what was in my mind on April 27th, 1987, when I refused to leave 187 East McMill Street, whatever it is, was how much I love God and Jesus, his son, as my personal Savior. And how much I love unborn babies. And the prosecutor says, objection. The judge said he's just speaking to his state of mind at the time he was there. I mean, we didn't care if we were found guilty. We didn't care if we were fined or put in jail or whatever the case may be. What we wanted to do was speak on behalf of unborn children. And that door opened wide, and I took the next 15 to 20 minutes to say everything I wanted to say about why we were there. Well, the prosecutor came up and he said, isn't it true, Mr. Dalbey, that you were asked to leave by the police and you didn't leave? Because when you're on the stand, you have to incriminate yourself. I said, yes, and now everyone here knows why, don't they? Probably shouldn't have said that, but I really wanted to say that. So a few minutes later, a woman in the group, in our group of 5, went up and did the same thing. And the prosecutor got up and he said, isn't it true there are people that love Jesus as much as you and think a woman should have a right to an abortion? And I said, objection. And the judge said, what's the basis of your objection? I said, the prosecutor's own motion says that under cross-examination he can't talk about abortion or when life begins. And the judge said, sustained. And the prosecutor literally threw his papers up in the air in frustration. Well, that's not the end of the story. We were found guilty and fined and given 40 hours of community service. We told Judge Allen we thought we had already been doing the community a great service. But I got to do my 40 hours in the Cincinnati Free Store downtown, and everybody was wondering what I was doing there. So I had lots of opportunities to talk to lots of people about unborn children, women in crisis pregnancies, and the gospel. Well, that's not the end of the story. 2 years later, there's a John Guest evangelistic crusade in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I attended it and was there, and then one of the nights I was there, sitting on the stage was Judge Nadine Allen. And I thought, isn't this interesting? And she gets up and gives her testimony about coming to Christ a couple of years prior to that. So I went up afterwards. I said, you may not remember me. And she says, I remember you. And she proceeded to tell me that she had become a Christian shortly before our trial. And that there was so much pressure in the county courthouse, Hamilton County, Ohio, to silence why we did what we did. And she felt that that was not right, and that she wanted to give us an opportunity to at least say why we did what we did. So the Lord intervenes in our lives. He uses us as his instruments in usually far less dramatic ways than the story I just told you. And just the simple word and a simple act of love and kindness and a willingness to raise our children to understand these issues, to find opportunities in loving, winsome ways to help out at a crisis pregnancy center like Thrive, to do a simple thing today like standing and crying out to God in a public way saying, abortion kills children. Jesus heals and forgives. Jesus cares for the women in a crisis pregnancy. It is something that God chooses to use in his own amazing and wonderful way. A couple of gospel takeaways 30 years later, and then I'll be done. One of the passages that has impacted me in the last few years, perhaps more than any other, is in Luke chapter 8, verses 1 and 2, where it says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And he did that, and the disciples watched, and in chapter 9 of Luke, he sends out the disciples 2 by 2, and they come back. And then in chapter 10, he sends out the 72, and that's where it begins to get to our crowd. That he wants us to proclaim and bring the good news of the kingdom of God. When? all the time. Where? Everywhere we go. And with whom? Everybody we come in contact with. So God puts opportunities in our lives all the time. And if we're willing to follow him into those places that we have influence, and to pursue places to try to have more influence, and proclaim with our mouth and bring with our lives, it's the action that Pastor was talking about today, into those places. We are to be love in action. It's not just behold how they love one another, but look how they love everywhere they go. We love because we've been loved first by Christ himself. When we see a brother in need and we close our heart, then people can say, how does the love of God abide in that person? It's 1 John 3. We're to be the embodied love of Christ. We are his hands and his feet. We're to love our neighbors sacrificially. And life matters related to the unborn, the aged, the handicapped, the marginalized, the enslaved. We are to speak and rescue. It's a matter of grace and truth. And don't let the people with a liberal agenda steal the phrase social justice. Make sure that they understand that the matter of rescuing and caring for the unborn is a matter of social justice. Make sure that they understand that human trafficking is a matter of social justice, and that rooted in the Micah 6 biblical understanding of God's righteousness and justice, we need to say there must be justice for the unborn. There must be justice for the handicapped, and for lots of people that are part of this life issue. So we're called to gospel wisdom and gospel courage. In the midst of this, trying to decide whether or not to be involved in this and working with our church and others, I came up with this phrase back over 30 years ago now. Sometimes, in the name of courage, we do foolish things. Sometimes, in the name of wisdom, we are paralyzed and afraid. So we give into our fears and call it wisdom, or we give into foolishness and call it courage. And different ones of us struggle on different ends of that. But what God needs from his people is courageous wisdom. Knowing how to enter a situation and understand what's needed, and then lean into it, trusting him to give us strength to overcome our fears, to do the things that he calls. Sinful passivity, which is usually my temptation, masquerading as godly patience, is still sinful passivity. And God has to convict me of that over and over again. I think I'm being a patient man when I'm actually being a fearful man. But there's some on the other side, sinful mistreatment of others in the name of bold love is still sinful mistreatment of others. And that's a temptation for people as well. They walk all over people and call it bold love, when it's actually mistreating people and not loving those made in the image of God well, often fellow Christians. And in the midst of all of this, we have to be reminded that these things are heavy. They weigh us down. And Jesus invites us, in the midst of whatever kind of strife and battle and difficulty we're facing on these issues and beyond, to come to him when we're weary and heavy laden. And he will give us rest, even in the storm, even in the difficulties, even when being taken off to jail, to know that our rest and our hope and our confidence is remaining yoked to him. So as we participate in a important, small step today, let's do this in love for God, in love for unborn children, in love for other marginalized people, and in love for our brothers and sisters who see differently than us, that they might come to know the truth that will set them free. Thank you.